Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you for speaking to Ceasefire. My first question is, in a very positive review of your book, Fateful Triangle, in 1984, the late Edward Said wrote that the irony is that Chomsky does not reflect theoretically on what he does. He just does it. So, on the one hand, he leaves us to suppose that telling the truth is a simple matter, while, on the other hand, he compiles masses of evidence showing that no one really can deal with the facts. How can we then suppose that one man can tell the truth? Do you agree with this criticism? And is there a reason why you do not reflect theoretically, to use his phrase, on what you do?
I don't call what I do theoretical reflection, but it's just as theoretical as anything else in the field. The reason I don't call it theoretical is it's too thin. I mean, in other areas, like, say, my professional work, yes, I talk about theories, but what's called theory in the social sciences, public commentary, and so on, is at best common sense. I don't think there's any theoretical depth. So Edward was old and close friend. We often talked about this, but I just don't see any theories. So I prefer not to use the honorific term, but I don't see how these descriptive accounts are less theoretical than what's called theory.
In the recent wave of protests in the Middle East, those in Iraq have been largely ignored. For instance, on the 25th of February, 15 people were killed, and there have been reports of journalists getting tortured in a violent crackdown. At the same time, it seems that the electoral system that has been bequeathed by the occupation is entrenching sectarianism in the country. And my question is, in this context, do you think there are prospects for a peaceful, democratic Iraq?
First of all, mild correction. I don't think the electoral system was bequeathed by the occupation. It was created in opposition to the occupation. It's worth remembering that the U.S. tried very hard from the beginning to prevent a functioning parliamentary system from developing. Tried to block elections. When it couldn't block them, it tried to manipulate them. Couldn't manipulate them, it sort of tried to influence the outcomes in some other way. So there is a kind of a parliamentary system, but it's a little bit misleading to say that the occupation bequeathed it. It, in fact, tried to prevent it. Of course, the official story is different, but it's pretty clear from the events. Anyhow, the system such as it is it's a pretty authoritarian system with lots of internal conflicts. Not clear how they're going to be resolved. The country was left as a total disaster. I mean, hundreds, thousands of people killed, millions of refugees. A lot of the educated classes fled, destroyed. The ones who would participate in rebuilding the country. There's a Sunni-Shia conflict was created. I mean, you know, there had been tensions, but nothing very severe. And as a result of the occupation, it just blew out of control, became massive. By now, say, Baghdad is fairly quiet, but the reason is it's mostly ethnically cleansed. The groups have been forcefully separated. And how all that'll be overcome is hard to say. Incidentally, there's also uprisings in the Kurdish areas in Kurdistan against the also quite harsh authoritarian regime up there. There's demonstrations, protests, effort to get minimal freedoms, freedom of press, and so on. So the whole area is in turmoil. I mean, it was really hit by a sledgehammer. And how Iraqis will reconstruct something out of this is not easy to say.
You have said that states are violent entities, constrained only by outside force or their own populations, and also that there are no good states. Is this the case even with emerging countries in the south like Bolivia and Venezuela? And do you think there are prospects for a peaceful world that is composed of states?
I mean, if Bolivia became a major regional power, I'd expect it to act violently. States are, it's not a simple principle, but by and large, there's a tendency for states to be violent to the extent that they have power, meaning to the extent that they have freedom of action. If the freedom of action, as you quoted, can be either lack of external or internal constraints. That's a pretty typical property of states, and I don't think whether that happens or not depends on what the states are like. So if a state becomes really internally democratic, responsive to popular will, not under the control of concentrated domestic power of some sort, then people aren't necessarily aren't violent. They'd rather live in peace. So it might be constrained. Actually, things change over time. I mean, take, say, Europe. For centuries, Europe was the most savage place in the world, in large measure as a result of the policy of state formation. Imposition of state structures is a pretty violent process. The state structure itself, with rare exceptions, does not correspond to the nature of the society on which it's imposed. Societies have to be forced together into a mold, even if they're very distinct. Iraq's a perfectly good case. The British put together pieces that had nothing to do with each other, so that tends to be tension. And that's true that was true right through the history of modern Europe. It was an unusually savage place, in fact developed a culture and technology of savagery which helped it conquer the world. And finally, in 1945, Europe settled into what's probably a long, maybe permanent peace. The reason is pretty straightforward. The Europeans recognized they just could not continue with this. If there was a move to a third world war, it would be the end. I mean, the level of destructiveness, violence, and so on had reached such a peak that it just couldn't be used anymore. So yes, now Europe is pretty much peaceful. On the other hand, if you look around the world, the conflicts that are raging all over are to a very large extent a result of the imposition of nation-state structures by European imperialism on regions where they have little, if any, relation to the interests and needs of the populations, so that the effects of European state creation are still being felt in terrible conflicts all over. Can this change? Yes, it can change the way it has changed in Europe. It can change if the states themselves internally change in such ways that the populations are unwilling to support violent action and press for peaceful measures. If you look at popular opinion, that's usually what people want. I mean, so take the United States. A considerable majority of the population thinks that the United Nations, not the United States, should take the lead in international conflicts. In fact, the majority even support giving up the veto at the Security Council and following the will of the majority, even if the U.S. doesn't like it. I mean, those are kind of unthinkable notions among policy elites, but it is popular opinion, similarly on many other issues. So there's a hope, and I think state structures should and can, in fact, be simply eroded. I mean, to an extent, that's happening in Europe. So state borders are less sharp than they were, say, a century ago. You can cross from one place to another freely. There's more interaction. State systems are still there, but in a less sharp and harsh form than in earlier years, and it may continue. Also, there's a process inside Europe of a kind of regionalization, more developed in some countries than others, but say Spain, Catalonia has a fair amount of autonomy, Basque Country as well. Other regions may move in the same direction. In the United Kingdom, Wales, and Scotland, there's been a level of devolution, which is, again, kind of weakening state structures, all of which is a good thing, I think. So there can be changes.
Obama's election brought about much rhetoric of post-racial societies in the West. Do you think his election has significantly improved prospects for African Americans and others in the US? And how significant a role do you think race still plays today?
You want to see what role race plays? Take a look at the prisons, the poverty statistics, unemployment, and so on. It plays an enormous role. Takes just say the prison system. Prisons have exploded in the United States in the last 30 years. You go back to about 1980, incarceration rates in the United States were pretty much the same as other industrial countries, a little toward the high end, but not off the spectrum. And now it's 5 to 10 times as high. The prisons are populated overwhelmingly with African Americans, secondly, Hispanics, mostly men. The number of women is also increasing. It's not because of crime, and crime rates haven't increased. What's happening is there's a kind of a superfluous population, which is created by the very conscious, deliberate policies of hollowing out of production, meaning sending production abroad, which is fine for investors and managers and owners, but no good for the working class. Now, there's such a close race-class correlation in the U.S. that the effect of hollowing out production has been disproportionately felt by African Americans, so their level of unemployment is much higher, and there's nothing for them, you know. So huge numbers end up being sent off to the prisons. I think the probability for a young black male that he'll end up in prison is higher than that he'll go to college. That's one residue of racism and slavery, which is still extant, and there are many others. As I mentioned, poverty statistics, unemployment statistics, and so on. I mean, Obama's election was a kind of a psychological shot in the arm, and important in that respect. But it really didn't have much in the way of objective change. Very little, in fact.
My next question is, the emerging movement against public sector cuts in Britain has so far been run along largely consensual decision-making lines without any clear leadership. But some have criticized it for lacking effectiveness due to this method. Often, for example, meetings can run for hours without decisions being taken because no one wants to assume authority. In your experience as an activist, how do you balance efficiency with anarchist principles?
I mean, it is true of participatory systems. They tend to be deliberative, as they should be. What often happens, unfortunately, is that a small segment which is willing to persist, can handle the boredom, isn't going to walk out, often end up taking control. So they do end up often quite hierarchical. And these are just problems that have to be worked out. There's no formula for it. I mean, I've been active in organizations in which they were worked out pretty well. There are others which they have not. As I say, there's no formula.
In Britain, the established Labour movement has faced a lot of criticism for having become too comfortable, too linked to sectors of power like the Labour Party, and averse to radical action. Many have dismissed the trade unions as irrelevant today. Do you think a strong public movement can be built without unions? And is it worth trying to revive and reform them?
Well, traditionally, organized labor has been in the forefront of almost every major significant movement for democratic expansion of democracy, for civil rights, human rights in general, and I think health reform, whatever it may be, And I think that's probably going to continue. If the labor movement is disoriented, suppressed, marginalized, atomized, as has been happening since the Thatcher years, I think that does not bode well for the chances of significant developments. You can see it right now in the United States, in fact. There's been a major attack on democracy, on rights, and so on, and on labor, and breaking it down. On the other hand, right at the moment, we're getting the first major popular uprising, and a significant one, against the process of moving towards a kind of corporate tyranny, and it's labor-based. It's based on, it's a reaction to attacks on the unions, the remaining ones, to try to take away their collective bargaining rights. And that's led to a significant popular uprising, surprising in fact.
My next question is, you have mentioned Gramsci's work before, and the way you describe intellectual culture in the West is similar to his own analysis of intellectuals. Is he still worth reading today? And do you think his work offers valuable insights?
I think he's worth reading. He's an important thinker. Like most commentators, I don't exclude myself, you can pretty well figure it out for yourself. I mean, he says there are things that are said well, they're suggestive, provocative, worth thinking through. But if there's anything profound, I've missed it.
Since the 1940s or the 50s, you've had to take position publicly on hundreds, if not thousands of issues. Are there any that you regret or that you feel you took the wrong decisions on?
Oh, yeah. Usually because I didn't do enough. So, for example, I was very heavily involved in the Indochina War, involved in resistance, facing long jail sentence and so on, but it was much too late. I didn't become seriously involved till the early 60s. At that point, the United States had already invaded South Vietnam and was practically destroying it. In the 10 years before, 1950s, the client government that the U.S. installed after it dismantled the peace agreements probably killed 60 or 70,000 people, and was so violent it instigated resistance. But during that period, there was unfortunately no protest, including me, just some talk about it, but nothing more. And there are many other cases like that. There's a lot more that should be done.
I want to ask you about the Middle East. On the one hand, we have Egypt and Tunisia, and on the other, we have what's going on now in Libya. What is your reading of the situation in Libya?
Well, Libya is quite different from all the other countries in the region. Libya is the one place where there was a very violent state reaction repressing the popular uprisings. Actually, Libya is not the only place. The other place, which isn't talked about very much, is Western Sahara. The current wave of uprisings, there have been many in the past, but the current wave actually began in Western Sahara in November, just right a couple of weeks before the Tunisia uprising. There was a nonviolent protest of Sahrawis, the indigenous people, against the quite brutal and illegal Moroccan invasion. Morocco invaded Western Sahara, was subject to decolonization under the UN auspices, and Morocco, in violation of Security Council, other resolutions, invaded, occupied the country, and transported a lot of people in, which is illegal, and has run a very repressive and brutal regime, and has rejected every effort at negotiation and settlement. And in November, that happened again. And this time, the Moroccan forces came in, crushed the uprising. It was harsh enough so that it did come to the United Nations, which theoretically is responsible for what happens there. It's a supposedly UN administered territory for decolonization. There were initiatives to have at least an inquiry, But France, it's the main protector of Morocco, intervened and blocked it. So nothing happened, and it was barely reported. But Libya was, the reaction was far too extreme to avoid, and besides, the West is anti-Gaddafi anyway, so it was an easy, it was easy to become outraged at what indeed was and remains outrageous, the violent repression of the uprising. So it's different than the other cases. On the other hand, if the uprising spread to Saudi Arabia, I wouldn't be surprised to see the same thing. That's, in fact, the U.S. and its allies have already shifted their rhetorical positions. In the case of Egypt and Tunisia, they didn't like the popular uprising of overthrowing dictators that they had strongly supported, but they could sort of tolerate it as long as there was no significant regime change, and there really hasn't been. But if you get to Saudi Arabia, it's quite different. I mean, that's the jewel in the crown. That's where most of the oil is. And any serious move towards democratization there would be pretty harshly resisted by the U.S. and its allies.
My final question to you, Professor Chomsky, is about Palestine. In particular, I wanted to know what your opinion was on the Palestine papers recently leaked to the press, and also your broader view of Palestine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what you think will happen there in the future.
The Palestinian papers, they didn't give us a lot of new information, some, but not a lot. But what they revealed is a very weak position of the Palestinian negotiators. I mean, they have, I don't blame them for this, they simply are in a weak position. And that showed in the offers that they were making. At the same time, it showed the total arrogance and contempt of the Israeli negotiators, who assume, and on the basis of the distribution of power in the region, it's understandable, they assume they can get what they want. And it also showed the contempt of the United States. The statements by Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton were dismissive of the Palestinians, were pretty ugly. So it showed something about the attitudes of the participants, which is not a great surprise, but unfortunately it's pretty realistic. As for the prospects, I think the options are not being described accurately by those who have Palestinian interests at heart, either the Palestinians themselves or the solidarity groups. The way it's almost always discussed is that there are two options. Either there'll be a two-state settlement along the lines of the overwhelming international consensus, or else, as Palestinian leaders have said, we'll give Israel the keys. They can take over the whole territory, and there'll be an anti-apartheid struggle on the South African model. Israeli leaders have said the same thing. Those who are in favor of some sort of partial settlement said, well, if we don't do it, we'll face this terrible demographic problem. There'll be a huge Arab population in what we want to be a Jewish state. However, those are not the two options. There's a third option, which is a much more significant one. The third option is exactly what's happening. The U.S. and Israel, working together, are instituting a form of control and domination, which is neither a two-state settlement nor taking over the whole territory, which Israel doesn't want. They've created a framework. It grows out of old plans, going back to the Alon plan, took another form under the Sharon plan, and Olmert had his own version. But basically, Israel takes everything to the west of the annexation wall, it's misleadingly called separation wall. It includes arable land, control over a lot of the water resources, the pleasant suburbs of the major cities in Israel, linked to them by superhighways and so on. Take over the Jordan Valley, from which Palestinians are by now pretty much excluded, and drive salients through the country. There are several breaking up the rest into pretty much unviable cantons. That way Israel will take over about half the territory and integrate it into Israel. They have huge infrastructure projects for Israelis and visitors only, not for local people. So you can drive quite easily from Ma'ale Adumim, halfway into the West Bank to Tel Aviv, let's say, and not even seeing an Arab. You would know there is one, maybe some man up on a hill leading a goat or something like that. But and the remaining Arab population will they may have an economically sustainable existence, and in fact, in Ramallah, the elites may live pretty well, on foreign money and so on. But theaters, concerts, sort of a Western-style life, but a neo-colonial arrangement with no prospects for any form of independent development, and the rest will drift away. And as far as Israel's concerned, that's fine. They don't want them. So there won't be a demographic problem. Too many Arabs in a Jewish state, and there won't be two states. That's the ongoing option. And there isn't going to be any handing over the keys. Israel's not going to take them. Meanwhile, Gaza will be kept separate from the West Bank. That's in violation of international agreements, but Israel and the U.S. have been dedicated since 1991, actually, to separate Gaza from the West Bank. By now, it's a very sharp separation. But Gaza will just stay an open-air prison, as it's often called.
Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you very much for speaking to Ceasefire.